the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
I'm very honored to have Jodee Blanco with me today for a conversation about bullying. Now, and we're going to kind of look at the trauma that bullying victims endure and how that affects how they navigate their marriages, that how they bring that trauma into adulthood and how it affects some of their adult relationships. We're going to focus on adult survivors of bullying, and Jodee's done a lot of wonderful work there, has a lot to say on that. So, but let's get going with Jodee. Hello, Jodee.
Hi, Doug. It's so good to be with you today.
It's so good to have you on, and thank you. I know you're really busy today. You're at a school, and you're busy all day and all afternoon, and you carved out a little bit of time for us. I appreciate that.
I did indeed. I do an anti-bullying program in schools all around the country called InJuts, Not Just Joking Around, and I do student presentations and a faculty professional development, and I do a lot of work. Your
website, you label yourself a voice for America's bullied. Tell me about that. How did you become the voice for America's bullied?
Well, I'm 60 years old, and from 5th grade through high school, I was the kid that nobody wanted to be caught dead hanging out with. I was the school outcast for the same reason that a lot of kids struggle today, simply for being different. I was an old soul, and I struggled to fit in. And so I never really imagined that I would write about those experiences. But in my late 30s, I built a real successful career in PR and communications on the entertainment side. I just decided to share my story, and the book became an overnight New York Times bestseller to my shock.
Oh, wow.
And I started responding to cries for help from kids, and over time, I was the first adult to ever look back on her school experiences being bullied and turn that into a book and then go into schools and talk about it. So that's how I became sort of the first voice of the movement.
Wow. Yeah, which is kind of interesting because it's such a big problem. You would think there would be more people out there trying to fix it. But how big is it? Do you have any statistics about what size the problem is in our high schools and grade schools these days?
Well, the statistics change, and I'm not a statistic person. The statistic is used to be 67%, but I don't believe in statistics because part of the challenge, Doug, is how we define bullying.
Yeah.
Most people, when they define bullying, they don't understand it at all. They define bullying, whether it's at the student level or at the adult level, as you hear all kinds of stuff like aggressive, continued negative behavior, harassment, verbal abuse. And yes, that's all bullying. But there's another type of bullying, and this is especially relevant to our subject today, which is invisibilizing. In other words, what I tell students is that bullying isn't just the mean things we do. It's all the nice things we don't do. It can also be a sin of omission, like not smiling at someone. Someone smiles at you at school or someone smiles at you at work that you really admire, and they know you admire them. And instead of smiling back, you give them a stare that makes them feel judged and small.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people, not just at school, but adults too. They're not necessarily bullied per se at work or at school. They're not necessarily intentionally excluded. They're just not on anyone's social radar.
Wow.
They disappear through the woodwork, and so they feel unseen and unheard. And when you have someone, especially if they went through school that way, they were bullied and or invisible, particularly invisible, and then they get a job and they feel invisible again, and it just reinforces all that sustained trauma, then they end up in a relationship where they feel invisible. We don't tend to think about how we're treated at school as being the kind of origin trauma that can impact our relationships. We tend to think of, early childhood trauma.
Sure.
But a lot of stuff that happens to us in school needles at us in our adulthood, and if unresolved, can certainly affect a marriage. It sure did mine.
Wow. So, interesting. So, okay, if you don't mind, tell us, since this is a show focused on marriage, talk, if you don't mind, sharing your marriage story with us.
No. I'm an open book. I'm an open book.
Had a girl.
Well, it's interesting. I was only ever married once, and I was 40 when I got married, and oddly enough, and if anyone's going to read my book, please stop laughing at me. Spoiler alert here, but when I went to my 20th high school reunion, it changed my life. because I was terrified to go. And a lot of the kids who ostracized me in school or who bullied me or who were just the mean members of the cool crowd that I call elite tormentors, they were actually, they remembered. And they were apologetic. And in fact, some of them became some of my greatest friends and supporters in my work as an anti-bullying activist
Is that
later
right?
on.
Wow.
Yes. And forgiveness can't be overestimated. And one of the people at my high school reunion, he was, one of the guys in school, and we connected at my high school reunion and fell in love and got married.
Oh, my.
And we ended up getting divorced. We made it for about 7 years. But and I share this with kids when I go to schools, when I do my middle and high school presentations, I talk about this. Honestly, and I say this with abject truth and humility, I own half of what went wrong in that marriage. I own half and he owns half, and the origin of what happened is bullying related, long-term effects. My ex-husband wasn't necessarily bullied in school, but he was bullied by some family members. And that left him, angry and struggling with it. Yeah. And I was bullied at school. So when we got married, we were both struggling with these unresolved issues. And it affected our marriage because I was ignored and invisible all through school. And when I wasn't invisible, I was being judged or put down.
Well.
So, and the harder I tried, the worse it got because I ended up trying too hard and it was weird and alienating for my classmates. Well, I did the same thing in my marriage. I tried too hard. I pushed too hard. And it was also hard for me to trust my husband because I didn't believe I was lovable. So how can you be married successfully if you don't believe you're lovable? Because then the very act of your spouse loving you makes you suspicious.
Wow. Yeah, this whole concept of invisibility, I hadn't thought about that before, but that's a powerful thing. I mean, when I went into my senior year of high school, I hesitate to share this story. I made a conscious decision that I was going to say hello to every single person in my class every day. And there's like 180 kids in my class. And I became a really popular guy just because I said hello to people. And I started realizing, then all of a sudden I had a lot of people kind of following me around, talking to me, sitting with me at the lunch table. And now that you mentioned, I'm thinking these were really lonely people. These were people who were invisible in my class that nobody paid any attention to. And I just simply said hello to them, and it was a really big deal. I hadn't thought about it until you just brought that up. Amazing.
Well, and the interesting thing here is that, most people think of bullying in terms of aggressive acts of unkindness, right, or harassment. Well, this has always been my experience as a survivor, and I find it to be the experience of thousands of kids whom I have worked with and interviewed and thousands of adults. I mean, so this is not a random thing. And there's logic here, too. So there's two types of bullying, whether it's in school or in the adult world. Overt. Overt bullying is the obvious. Yeah. Digital abuse, cyberbullying, teasing, verbal abuse, physical abuse. It's all the obvious forms. But then you have what we've been talking about, which is I call the invisible student or the invisible soul. And that's someone who they believe they're disliked. They believe there's something wrong with them, but often there's not. They're just invisible. They're not on anyone's radar, and no one thinks they need to be. They're just not seen. Yeah. And in the long term, especially in a school setting, so for listeners who are adults now, and now they're starting to think, right, as they're listening to us about their school experience, think about this. Let's say that there's a bully or a group of bullies at school or elite tormentors, and they harass you every day and they tease you every day, and maybe someone slams you into a locker every day. After a while, you're going to say to yourself, there's something wrong with that person. That's a bully. They're slamming me into a locker every day. Yeah. But if all that person does is not smile at you when you smile at them, or stare at you as you pass them in the hall with a judgmental demeanor, or not ever invite you to anything, not talk to you, not include you. It's not going to make you wonder what's wrong with them.
Yeah.
It's going to make you ask yourself, what's wrong with me? And to any parents in the audience, that's when we know that bullying is beginning to have a long-term effect on a child. When the child stops asking what's wrong with the bullies and they start asking what's wrong with me.
Interesting.
And if that question goes unanswered, it lingers through adulthood and certainly can color the vibrancy of a marriage.
And especially, I would think, this invisibling thing in terms of, like, everyone else, I'm looking around and everybody else seems to have friends, but me, right? And all of a sudden it's like, wow, they all have friends and I don't. So the problem's got to be me, not them, right?
Right.
Wow.
Yes. And it affects marriages. I mean, when we talk about FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. For a bullied or invisibilized student, that is a much more profound impact. Like I always tell people, and I said this to my ex-husband, and I've said this to other, men who I've loved, with whom I've been in very long-term relationships with, is the thing about that fear of missing out is that you feel you always want to blame yourself.
Yeah.
You always want to say, well, what's wrong with me? What did I do wrong? And, and there's a desperation that accompanies that. And I know that in past relationships, in my marriage and other relationships, I know that fear of missing out, that fear of being exclusion. I've always said I didn't fear abandonment. It wasn't abandonment I feared. It was exclusion. And that puts a lot of stress on a relationship. Think about it. Because if you're married, part of a healthy marriage is both of you being independent, whole people. Yeah. That you have a life together, but you have your own independent interests. You have your own independent interests and things that you do. So if you're always afraid that you're being excluded, it puts a strain on that healthy individuality that you need in relationships that thrive.
So in your opinion, does this fear prevent you from really knowing who you are and becoming comfortable in your own skin and accepting yourself?
Yes, and I could tell you, and when you're evolving, and being really raw and honest and open here about this. When I was younger, and being bullied in school, the worst part of the week for me was the weekends, because I knew that when all the other kids were hanging out together, I was by myself on a Saturday night, and it was horrible. And I carried that into adulthood. So when I was married, and even before marriage, I've had a few boyfriends over the years, very long term. And if they didn't want to see me on a Saturday, or if we got into an argument and I knew that I wasn't going to see them on a Saturday, I would panic. It would be this intense feeling of loneliness, same one I felt when I was in school. And so you don't get to know yourself because you're too afraid to be alone with yourself.
So this idea that if I'm alone, somehow there's something wrong with me, I'm not worthy, that got cemented into your brain in high school. And it's
no, middle school.
Middle school. Okay, so it's getting set into your brain at 13, 14, 12.
Right.
And here you are, you're 40, you're married, and it's still there. It's still a problem.
It's still a problem, and it's still anxiety. And it took me years of therapy, and I work with a great therapist in Illinois. He's fabulous. And it took me years of therapy and a lot of seminars and educating myself. And also, when you're an author and you write about your own life and you write memoir, you have to be brave enough to look at your icky stuff and try to make sense of it so you can help others with their icky stuff.
Yeah, right. And knowing that you put your icky stuff out there, some people may make fun of it or criticize it, or right? I mean, you draw a bullseye on your forehead when you do that.
Right, and I'm no longer afraid of that at all. And so, But what I learned from my therapist is that, I have to be comfortable with being alone on a Saturday night. And now to talk about progress and that it is possible. I am single, right?
Yeah.
I'm not married. I'm not in any long-term relationship. I just had one that lasted 10 years. And when Saturday night comes, I no longer panic that I'm by myself or there's something wrong with me. I relish having a night to myself that I could watch movies and make myself dinner.
Yeah.
I enjoy time alone as much or more than I enjoy time with loved ones.
Yeah.
And to reach that is a huge marker, particularly for a survivor of school bullying. And for anyone who's listening to us,
Yeah.
I know how hard it can be, that if you're in a long-term relationship or married and those ghosts from school, those negative voices, they still play in your head. And sometimes they play when you have an altercation with your significant other, your husband or your wife. It's really important, and I can't encourage you enough. Find a good therapist, someone who considers school bullying to be as profound a form of abuse as any of the other forms, who will work with you to turn off those voices in your head.
Wow.
So that you don't project your school experience onto your relationship experience.
Yeah, boy, that's wise advice. This entire episode of Marriage Unhindered is on the updated Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers.